Hello all. We will be starting very soon. Please give us a few more. Let's wait up 10:05 for more people to join, and we will start. Hello everyone. Can somebody confirm that you can hear me well?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Thank you. Okay, it's time to start this exciting online workshop. Okay, first and foremost, I welcome you all for this 4-day online workshop called Inclusive Ecology. So we are starting with a short introductory sort of session to introduce what this program is about and how you can make best use of this. Okay, and we really hope that you will participate very actively in all the 4-day sessions and interact with various faculty and students of CES and make the best use of this workshop. So let me start without further delay. So let me introduce briefly about myself. My name is Vishwesha Guttal. I'm a faculty member at Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science. And now let's go on to the details of the workshop. What is this workshop about? So one of the main goals of this workshop is to reach out to diverse student pools and attract and create interest in various fields of ecology, evolution, behavior, and conservations. These areas are relatively underrepresented in the larger biological sciences community in India. So we have a very large number of undergraduate programs in biotechnology, microbiology, and so on and so forth. And relatively, those focusing on ecology, evolution, behavior, and conservation are small. So our idea is to introduce you to a larger pool of students who are interested in these fields, but are not finding opportunities. And in doing so, the way we plan to do is to introduce the basic research themes in these 4 fields, EEBC, and we not only want to introduce you to various fields, we also want to introduce you, what does it mean to be a researcher? So one of the goals of this workshop is to attract more students towards PhD and science careers. So, but of course, for any student who is planning to do so, you must also be aware of what kind of professional skills does it mean or does it require to be a researcher or a scientist. So the focus is not just on teaching concepts in the field, but also various professional skills one needs to develop. Okay, so the way we have structured the workshop is as follows. The workshop runs for 4 days. I'm really sorry that I have made a mistake in the year. We are in year 2023 now. So it's today and tomorrow, 17th, 18th, and then next Friday and Saturday, 24th and 25th. And all these days, the workshop runs roughly from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. with sufficient breaks in between. And we would like that this is in a workshop mode, not in a sort of lecture mode. Therefore, we really encourage a lot of participation. Okay, so let me give a brief introduction to Center for Ecological Sciences, who are the various faculty in our department, and who will be teaching what in the coming days, coming workshop. So in our department, the research is focused into 4 broad areas: ecology, conservation, animal behavior, and evolution. These are the 4 broad areas, and we so if you think of a typical biological microbiology or biotechnology laboratories, you are in an enclosed space working with small things. For us ecologists, the entire India is our laboratory, and we have various field stations spread across India, all the way from Himalayas in the north to northeastern Himalayas, and of course a whole bunch of field stations from marine ecosystems to extremely highly arid ecosystems. Okay, and in our department there are 10 to 12 faculty members, a couple of honorary professors. We have roughly about 50 PhD students, and on an average every year 5 to 10 students graduate with PhDs. In addition, we have a large pool of BSc and MSc students who do their undergraduate thesis with us. Some of them are from IISc, but we also have students from other institutes, including ICERs, including other universities in India. And we also host internships And these internships could come in the form of, for example, academics, academies of Indian Academy of Sciences offers internship programs. Earlier there used to be a KVPY, fellowship program, Inspire fellowship program, and so on. So there could be also internship opportunities for students in our departments, and these typically last for a couple of months in the summer. And these are, made use of by BSc and MSc students. So now what's in this workshop? So this is how the first week's workshop is structured. 17th Feb today, and tomorrow 18th Feb. So after this brief introductory note by me, we have two workshops today, roughly 3 hours each. Today we will cover ecology and evolution, and tomorrow we will cover quantitative thinking in ecology and why it is really important for research. And tomorrow's afternoon session is very, very important, as important as other sessions which are more pedagogical in nature. In Saturday afternoon session, we will have topics such as, how do you apply for PhD programs? How do you prepare for interviews? And what does it mean to be a PhD student? So these topics will be covered by current CES students who have gone through this process. Okay. So let me introduce faculty members who will be teaching today and tomorrow. The first workshop is by Professor Saskia von Hughes, who will speak about ecology today, starting in about a few minutes. Her research areas are broadly population and community ecology, including behavioral ecology. And she addresses a number of conceptual questions, including metapopulation theory, how competition plays in insects, what are the impacts of plant defense on multi-trophic interactions, and including applications of ecological theory in pest controls. And a very, this has elements of both basic ecology as well as applied ecology. So Saskia will be our first speaker today, and she will start in a few minutes. Now, in the afternoon today, we have Karthik Shankar, who studies evolutionary ecology and biogeography. He will do a workshop on evolution starting at 2 o'clock. And he again studies a very wide variety of questions in his laboratory, starting from behavior and ecology of grouping, in particular mixed species grouping. And he also looks at evolution and how animals are spread in biogeographically in a number of taxa, frogs, lizards, snakes, and so on. In addition, he also works on marine turtle biology as well as conservation. And he also is a founder and trustee of Dakshin Foundation, which has a large component of marine conservation. And tomorrow morning, we have Kavita Ishwaran, who will talk about the importance of quantitative thinking when it comes to ecology. So ecology is not just looking at nature, but when we want to study nature, be that plants or animals or ecosystems, we really need to think quantitatively. So Kavita will cover these topics. Her research interests are broadly in behavioral ecology, and how we can apply those to conservation as well. So she has extensively studied sexual selection and animal personality, vector ecology, and how does it influence disease transmission using mosquito as a model system. And she's also interested in how can we use behavioral ecology approaches in the context of conservation, in the context of animals, antelopes, for example, in human dominated landscapes, and so on. Okay, so these are the three faculty who will speak this week. And as I already mentioned, tomorrow's afternoon session has 2 sessions run by CES students, where faculty will not be present, by the way. That way you can sort of ask questions and try to learn intricacies of, what does it mean to be a student? What does it take to apply for PhD programs? And of course, when we do this, we don't necessarily say only about CES programs. The ideas that students will present could also be broadly applicable, even if you want to pursue ecology career outside of CES. Okay. And by the way, by Sunday, which is the day after tomorrow, we'll also share with you a short 10-minute video of various faculty from CES. That way you can, because the workshops will be at a more basic level, whereas the faculty 10-minute videos will actually give a gist of what different faculty are trying to do in their research labs. And then looking at those, you may find some faculty research more interesting than others, and we will send you a form. If you want to have a one-on-one online meeting with any of the faculty members, please let us know, and we will circulate a form for doing so. Okay. And this is the week 2. I will not spend too much time on this. No, in the week 2 we have again very exciting set of workshops, one on behavior by Maria Thakur, and then communication skills, careers in ecology, conservation biology, and interaction sessions. I will not go through this in detail because we should really be getting going to start. This is Professor Maria Thakur, who will speak next week, who works on predator-prey interactions, and color trade-offs and phenotypic complexes in animal societies. Okay, and then as I already mentioned, next week of one of the sessions, one of the afternoons will be on communication skills, which is extremely important to be a scientist. And then the conservation biology workshop will be by Umesh Srinivasan, who works on fragmented landscapes and how they influence demography of various bird species. He looks at climate change and synergies between climate change and habitat degradation. Okay, that will be next week again. And let me also introduce you to other faculty members who will not be speaking very, very briefly. Karthik Sunagar works on evolution of animal venom in a variety of organisms. Extremely fascinating amount of work. This work involves not only field work, typical of our department, but also molecular biology work. And we also have Sumanta Bagchi, who is an ecosystem ecologist. He studies ecosystem structure, functions, and all the way to sustainability and wildlife conservation. And Professor Rohini Balakrishnan studies acoustic communication, in a variety of insects as well as bats. And again, how do they influence mate choice, sexual selections, and how does natural selection act on these signalers and receivers? Okay. And we also have Professor Rene Borges, who studies chemical ecology between plant and animals, how animals use chemicals to interact how chemicals play a role in interactions between plants and animals, nest architecture, as well as visual ecology, but that plays an important role in plant pollinators. Okay. And Praveen Karan studies evolutionary biogeography of various taxa in the Indian subcontinent, all the ways from langurs to insects. Okay. Okay. So again, you should take a look at his work as well. And as I said, we will be sharing videos that has 10-minute clips of most of the CS faculty. And then this is me. Finally, we use in our lab, we study animal behavior as well as ecosystem behavior. We study using many mathematical techniques. We use data as well as mathematical models. Okay. And then I already have mentioned that we have 2 honorary faculty, and we have an exciting museum and herbarium in our department, and a variety of facilities that will help in our research. Okay, so with that note, I will end my sort of introductory presentation, and if you have any quick questions, you can ask me before the first workshop on ecology starts. So I will stop sharing my screen. So any questions, any comments from anyone before the first workshop starts? Okay, so if there isn't really any, so I will request Professor Saskia Vanu to take over and start the presentation. Start the workshop on ecology.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen now.
Yeah.
Okay, you should be
yes, I can
seeing my
see it.
screen and seeing me.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just get my screen organized now. Okay, well, I'm happy to be here to be discussing ecology with all of you. And I want to so this is the very first workshop of the 4 days, and it's ecology, which is fundamental to all of the 4 days. And I want to start out. I want to start out by just, let's see, this isn't that. Okay, hang on. Okay. So I'm a relatively new faculty member in CES, and this is a picture of my lab group. And as Vishwesha explained, we study aspects of population and community ecology and behavior, especially of insects, and then also community ecology of plants that feed on them and insects that feed on those insects. And sorry, my slides aren't advancing. Okay, so what I want to do today is for you all to learn about and especially discuss what ecology is and how do ecologists study it in general. And definitely, I would like to focus on, what are the concepts and understanding them, and hardly any facts. I don't remember very many facts myself. And I really want you guys to think, think as we're discussing and ask questions. And the specific topics that I'm going to cover are, what is ecology? And then within that, why is an organism found where it is found on the globe? And then also thinking about what makes a population of organisms, so of one species, what makes that population size what it is, and how do we look at changes in population size? So those are sort of the 3 things I'm going to cover. And throughout the rest of the week, of course, other aspects of ecology are going to be covered. But in order for this to work, I need your all's participation. And so since this is the first one, I want to do a little practice. And so there's 2. One is raising your hand. And by hand, I don't mean your literal hand, because most of you, I can't actually see you. I just see a black box. So raising your hand using the little raising hand icon, which we're going to practice. Or writing things in the chat box. So first, we're going to try the raising your hand. So I want all of you to raise your hand if, when you go on a walk, you hope that you see a snake, or you hope that if you go on a walk, do you hope that you would see a snake? Okay, I want to see these raised hands.
In Ecology.
Okay.
Kasi nag-apply ako. Hindi natanggap kasi yung work.
Okay, is anybody raising their hands? Because I don't see any raised hands.
Diba yung...
Okay, I see raised hands now. Okay, so this is if you go on a walk, you would like to see snakes. Let's see, some of you have raised hands. Okay, so those of you who would like to see snakes, take your raised hand away. We're done with that question. And now, those of you who, if you went on a walk, hope that you don't see any snakes, you raise your hands. These are going to be different people.
Anong basic? Anong natanggap?
Hindi nga natanggap.
Okay. Has everybody raised their hands who hopes that they don't see a snake? Okay. Then all of you guys unraise your hands or put your hands down. Okay, let's see, there's still some hands up. Couple more hands are still up. Okay, I'll assume that you'll figure out how to get your hands down. Okay, so if you raise your hand, then me or Amanda, who's helping sort of keep this session in order, will sort of get my attention, and you can ask something or make a comment. So you can. So I definitely want you guys. I want to hear your voices. So if you have something to say, either a question or a comment or anything, then raise your hand, and hopefully you'll get our attention, and you can speak. And so the other way to interact is in the chat box. So I want everybody to write in the chat box. What I want you to write is, what's your favorite organism? Okay, everybody write down in the chat box your favorite organism. Okay. Snakes, cat, turtle, caterpillar, gray wolf, primates, honeybee, birds and butterfly, elephant, turtle, leopard. Okay. Lots of people managing to say something in the chat box. Okay. All right. Then now you've practiced, so now there's nothing in your way for participating. And the other thing is, if you want to, you're welcome to put your video on so I can see your face, and that's totally up to you. It's sort of nice to see some faces sometimes. All right, I'm going to move this chat box out of my way. Okay. All right, so what is ecology? So I'm going to right off the bat just say what I think ecology is, and then you guys can add on. So I think ecology is studying the relationships between the things that are living, so living organisms, including people, and their physical environment. And we can think about that at the scale of the individuals, or as populations, or as species, or communities, or ecosystems, or parts of the globe, or even globally. Do any of you have something to add to that definition of ecology, or an alternative definition? All right, well, what do you think I mean by physical environment? Okay, there's some more things here. Interactions between living and non-living. Yes, that's like the physical environment, sort of the non-living. Interactions among the living. I'm reading the notes. Interactions among the living, that's definitely true. So yeah, in this definition, it's a little ambiguous. It's the interactions between organisms and other organisms, and also between organisms and their environment. Abiotic factors, that's the physical environment in those words. Coexistence with other organisms. So yeah, one way to think about ecology is, how is it that different organisms on the earth are coexisting? That would be a kind of a definition. Okay. Any other additions? Okay. So yeah, in this definition I gave, definitely it's kind of missing the major component of, it's not just organisms, the relationship of organisms to the physical environment, it's also relationships of organisms with each other. Okay. Lots of times we think about this kind of hierarchically, like we can be an ecologist working on individuals, and especially when we're studying behavior, we might be doing that. We can be an ecologist who works on populations, which you're going to see an example of later this morning. You can think about the community, so that's the different species that live in an environment together. You can think about the ecosystem, which is sort of involving the different species that live in the community and the physical environment and the energy flow through the environment. Or you can think at a really large scale, the biome, where we're thinking about sort of either on the whole globe or whole regions of the globe, different sort of climatic regions. Okay, so that's sort of what is ecology, but what do ecologists actually study? So thinking kind of, again, hierarchically, one of the things is behaviors of organisms. So what do we mean by organisms? Okay, every living being. Anything that has life, a living unit. I'm reading the chat. Okay, those are all true. So I guess I want to just mention, so organism, for one thing, it includes humans. It includes plants and animals and all the one-celled organisms that may be not really plants or animals. It includes, viruses, bacteria, right? Those are all organisms. So all the living things. Okay. And then what do we mean by behavior? So what are examples of behavior? Okay. How things act. Well, that's kind of a definition of behavior. Altruism. So that's when organisms do things for the benefit of others. A response to a stimulus. So I guess that means a behavioral response to a stimulus. The way animals act. Okay, so even more specifically, like one behavior could be mating behavior, or feeding, or territorial defense, or escape behavior. Yeah, communication. So there could be individuals of the same species. So for example, for mating, they have to figure out if they are the same species and if they want to mate. Competition, yeah, predation, mutualistic behaviors. Okay, somebody asks, viruses live inside of the host. Are viruses considered organisms? Yeah, so this is back to what's an organism. So viruses are kind of tricky because living in a host, you can still be an organism. For example, a disease, a bacteria is definitely an organism. And most people consider viruses organisms as well, but you could argue that they're not really complete organisms because they depend on the DNA of the host. So it's a little bit ambiguous, but we generally count them as organisms. Okay, so one thing we study is the behavior of organisms. And by organisms, we mean all the living things, and we'll include viruses. And then we include the interactions between organisms. And we got at some of those interactions when we were talking about behavior. And so the broad categories of interactions are consumption, so organisms eating things, competition, mating behavior, an important thing for us to keep in mind is that these interactions between organisms, we can think of them either as between different species. So one species, might eat another species, or say a caterpillar would eat a plant, or they can be interactions between individuals of the same species, such as mating behavior, or say competition for food among individuals of the same species. So these interactions can be interspecific and intraspecific. Okay. And also these interactions can be negative. So for example, predation, negative in the sense that one of them gets harmed or killed, or they can be positive. Anybody want to say like an example of a positive interaction? We think a lot about negative ones, but what's a positive interaction between different species? So this is an interaction where both of them benefit. Okay, a mutualism, that's the word. I mean, that's the term, but what's an example of a mutualism? Okay, so one person says mixed foraging in birds. So if there's mixed foraging in birds, how is that positive? Okay, it's going by a little fast here. Okay, I'll stick it. Okay, so you guys have lots of examples of mutualisms here. And some of these are quite classic. So bees pollinating plants, it's positive because the plant needs to have its pollen spread among plants in order to reproduce sexually, and the bees get nectar and pollen. Classic example, mycorrhizae fungi living in the soil, associated with plant roots. They give the plant gives the mycorrhizae fungi carbohydrate, and the mycorrhizae fungi make nutrients available to the plant. Okay, so there's positive interactions, and then there's just classic negative interactions like predation, parasitism, competition. Okay, so these things are happening between individuals. And then we have the relationship of organisms to the abiotic environment that they're in. So for example, we need organisms need water, and that's an abiotic resource that we need. We're affected by temperature. That's also abiotic, although temperature, we also affect temperature, but most organisms don't affect temperature that much. So there's many different, so in a way, the abiotic environment sort of sets the constraints to where many organisms can live. Okay, so we have this behavior of organisms, and we have organisms and interactions between organisms, and the relationship of those organisms with the abiotic environment, which we'll talk about some more. And then those things, the behavior and the interactions and the constraints of the environment have these effects. And so we can think of the effects as explaining the sizes and the composition, the sizes of populations, the compositions of community. We can say, changes in the abiotic environment cause populations and communities to change. And if we think even on a larger scale, these things explain the distributions of species on the Earth. And we can think even on a larger scale of these organisms or communities and populations as interacting with the environment and energy flow through the system as the entire ecosystem. Okay, any comments right now? This is just kind of the basic, what is ecology? You guys see anything I'm missing? Anything? Okay. So as I mentioned, this is a huge topic, ecology. And so I'm going to focus in on two different things. Why is an organism or a species found just where it is found? And then how do we think about the sizes of population and population growth? And so it's not like these are the only things in ecology. They're just some things that I'm interested in and that aren't part of other workshops. Okay. So you know intuitively, and what you've learned, that if you go to different places, the environment is different and there's different species of organisms, right? So, we just take that for granted. And some places have, some places have a lot of diversity, and some places have not very much diversity. And some places have fish in them, and some places don't, because say they're not in the water. So there's all sorts of sort of explanations for why organisms are where they are that we just take for granted. But let's think now about more specifically, can we sort of qualify that thing that we take for granted? Okay, so the question is, why is an organism where it is on the Earth? So one of the reasons is kind of its evolutionary and geological history. So, there's three different ways. Well, there's a lot of different ways you could think about it, but three main ways that we should think about, that we can think about this. So one of them is that, well, different parts of the Earth are different, right? So for example, far away from the equator is different from near the equator, right? Climate-wise. That is shown, oh yeah, okay. And I'm going to show you more details about these things in a minute. So one of them is, so one thing is just sort of the past history. Where did organisms evolve? How has the climate been in the past, and the geology? And I'll show you some examples about that in a minute. And then if we think more short term, well, organisms are there because they've survived, right? So they're in a way, they're there because they're not dead and they've persisted. And that has to do with the current climate and the current conditions. And then whether or not biotic interactions, say competition, predation, mutualism, allows them to be there. And then finally, which is actually kind of in between number one and number two, there's dispersal. And so things arrive in a place through dispersal, and they either survive or they die. And if they survive, they may make a population and become part of a community. Or if they die off, then we don't know about them. And we can think about dispersal both sort of on an evolutionary time scale, like an evolutionary lineage moves to a place and then may speciate. Or we can think of it as an ecological time scale, like dispersal of individuals in a species to a new habitat patch, and then they occupy that habitat patch. And a super important aspect of dispersal is dispersal these years is dispersal caused by humans. So as you know, when you go walk around, there's a lot of invasive species around, and many communities are dominated by invasive species, and invasive species are kind of necessarily there because humans have facilitated their dispersal. Okay, so this first part, the first thing I said about evolutionary diversification, I'm just going to talk or show a little bit more about that because it's a little bit complicated. Okay, so one aspect of just looking at the pattern of where species are on the Earth is just looking at the patterns of diversity. And so this picture shows the diversity of angiosperm plants, and it's the plant families. And where it's red, there's a lot of plant families, and where it's blue, there's fewer plant families. And what is the main environmental component that is correlated with? This pattern of red and blue. Like if you think about that environment, what else looks like this has the same kind of pattern? Abiotic.
Temperature gradient.
A temperature gradient. Is that what you said? Yeah. Yes, exactly. So it's warmer near the equator, and it's cooler farther away from the equator. And there's also more water near the equator on the land. Yeah. Okay. So this species diversity gradient is associated with temperature gradient. Now, many ecologists study why is there that association, and there's actually lots of different possible reasons that are kind of overlapping that we're not going to talk about now, but it's interesting. But anyway, there is this climate gradation. Okay, so that's one sort of part of the explanation of why organisms are where they are. A second one is that so I'm thinking right now, just to make it simple, about organisms that live on land, but we can also think about organisms in the water, but let's just work on the land right now. It used to be, 1 billion years ago, the land masses were in different places. And so that means that organisms evolved in one place, and then now they're in a different place. And so where they are now kind of depends on where they were when they evolved, and then how the land masses moved. So this kind of shuffles things around, or in the past, or things got shuffled between the past and now. So that's a geological explanation. And then there's also, so that was like, whatever, 1 billion years ago, but millions of years ago, when the continents were kind of where they were, basically where they are now, the climate was actually different on the globe. And so it was warmer, and so it was warmer in the north than it is now. And it was also warm in the tropics. And in general, the whole Earth was warm. And so a lot of organisms kind of evolved in this warm environment. Some of them then moved, and some of them, as it cooled, moved south or north, depending on where they were, towards and stayed in the warm. And some of them evolved to be cold tolerant. But if we're just thinking about the distribution of species on the Earth, then we need to think about both this temperature gradient that exists, where the continents have been and how they shift around, and how the climate has changed over the period of time that there have been organisms evolving. Any thoughts about that you would like to share? Okay. Okay. So you could think of that as kind of a background sort of context for the diversity of organisms and which organisms are present. And then we think sort of more contemporarily about a population, say a population of some kind of organism. And we think, okay, what does it need to persist where it is? So it needs to have the right resources. The conditions have, so the abiotic conditions have to be correct. Things affect, its population size is affected by its birth and its death and say its generation time, things like that. Its ability to, yeah?
Yeah, Madhusri has a question in the comment.
Okay. Oh, in the comment. Okay. When continents were together, there wasn't room for much diversity, I guess. Let's see. Well, when there was, yeah, I'm not sure, not quite sure what you mean, because there was still a lot of space, but I guess the environment was more uniform. Isn't that why you think there would be less diversity?
Yes, ma'am. Like there was not much temperature difference, or they were not so far from equator. Also, I think they
Yeah.
might have been originated like a homogenized species like thing, because they were not much far away from the equator.
Okay, right. So you're considering, well, the environment was probably more uniform, and so there'd be sort of the same conditions, so you might end up with the same species.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Ma'am.
Okay, well, I can see why you're thinking that, but there's also an alternative, which is if you think about, say, the tropics compared to the tropics is a relatively big area, even in the Earth now, and there's the highest diversity of species, which is kind of the opposite of what you're saying. So, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Like there were not too much difference, like polar bears and what we have, sun bear, black bears, or like that, penguins and the feathery birds in our tropical region, like that. I was wondering.
Okay, yeah. So right. So that's a really good point. So maybe the number of species would still be high, but the variation in types of species would be low. That's, yeah, definitely. So there'd be no reason for polar bears, no reason for lots of cold tolerance, say, or yeah, if there's fewer different kinds of environment, then there's a much lower diversity of sort of species adaptations. So yeah, in that sense, the diversity would be lower, definitely. So yes, yeah, definitely, you're right. But in terms of, say, the number of different species, it might not be lower.
Yes, ma'am, with minute differences and diversities.
Exactly, right. So you can have things that are different species, but they're not very different ecologically. They fit in very similar niches.
Yes, ma'am. Like your initial point was like why the organisms present where they are. So I was wondering this question. Thank you.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So right, if conditions are similar, then you're not going to have organisms necessarily that evolve to be very different from each other. Okay. So for a population to be where it is, there have to be the appropriate resources, there have to be appropriate abiotic conditions, and then there have to be the biotic interactions that allow it. So, and this is both the negative and positive interactions. So what's an example of so intra-specific means within a species. So what kind of intra-specific interactions have to be there in order for the species to persist there in a place? Well, say one individual landed in a new environment, and the new environment had the resources they need.
I think they have to be the colony, they have to form colonies sharing the resources, or if they are unable to share the resources, then one fights over another.
Okay, okay. So if there's too much competition, then you wouldn't have very many individuals, or you wouldn't have very many different species. So there has to be available resources.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
true. Yes, right. Yeah. So, for example, if a new species comes into a community, then if all of the resources are being used, say a plant community, a new seed.
Everyone, we are going to start the next session now. This is a plenary about
Let's see.
design, and I am jumping in.
Sorry. I'm not sure what that was. Okay. Yeah, so if a species arrives in a community and say all of the say a seed arrives and there's no water available because all of the other plants are using up the water, and that seed won't survive. So the conditions, there has to be the environment competition has to allow the new species to come. And then the question I asked about the intra-specific interactions. So some species, for most species, not counting clones, there has to be several individuals of the same species in order for them to find each other and mate and have children. And in some cases, there's parental care and things like that, or group living. And so some species need to have, a number of individuals present in order to persist in a location. Okay. All right. So we sort of talked about the history sort of dictating which species might be somewhere, and then the very specific conditions in the place. So I want to talk a little more about the specific conditions. Okay. So by resources, we mean everything that's consumed by organisms, so not just consumed, or that are required by the organism. So some of these are obvious, like food, but some resources aren't quite so obvious. So write down in the chat resources organisms need. Food is sort of obvious. So say I already got food. Okay, nesting places, yes. So certainly for lots of birds, say, the number of birds in a place is dictated by the number of nesting sites. Shelter, many things need shelter. That's a resource that can be limiting. Okay, food, light, water, shelter. Yeah, so food for sure, light, most things need light. Choice of mate. So resources you could think of in the sense of other individuals in the same population. Nutrients falls under food maybe, but has to be present. Survival. Well, survival, right. So in order to survive, you need certain resources. Mating regions. So that would be like if a species is territorial, then there's competition for space for territories. Okay. All right. So you guys came up with most of them.
Ma'am,
Yes.
whether sunlight is considered as resource or not, because it is consumed in a sense, but it is not reduced.
No, yeah. So yes, light is definitely a resource, and in a sense, it's reduced. So, for example, trees will need light for photosynthesis in order to persist. And if you are a understory plant, then you're limited in light because the trees above you took it, right? So in that sense, it's a resource that can be used up. So light, definitely a resource. That makes sense. Okay, let's see what's happening here. Okay, somebody asked, what's the difference between resource and conditions? We're going to get to that because we're doing resources now and then we'll do conditions. Okay. Okay, so light, energy, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, food, physical space. And by physical space, then we get like nesting sites and things, but it could also be, say, sticks to make a nest out of if you're a bird. That could be a limiting resource. So a good way to think about a resource is, could you use it up? So if there was a lot of individuals or a lot of species, would that get used up in the sense of you don't really use up? Well, yeah, in the sense of some use it, and so it's inaccessible to others. Okay, those are resources. Any more resources that you're dying to get out there? Okay, well, somebody asks, will the atmosphere be counted as a resource as it is universal and some organisms are anaerobic also? So it can be counted as a resource. Well, let's see, the atmosphere, do you mean like the ozone layer? And I'm not sure. Do you mean the, let's see. So anaerobic organisms, they have limiting resources also, but they just aren't limited by the same resources as aerobic organisms. But I'm not quite sure about the atmosphere question. I'm just not quite sure what it means. If anybody's got an answer to that, you could answer it, or you can explain it to me a little more. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, these are the resources. And then okay, conditions. So somebody asked, what's the difference between resource and condition? That's a reasonable question. So condition is sort of the abiotic environment that influences sort of the functioning of organisms. And that sounds quite close to resource. And so I'll just list some so you kind of see what I mean. So this is sort of thinking of what do you need? So for example, any kind of organism needs some range of temperatures. If it's too hot, they can't function. If it's too cold, they can't function. They need a certain humidity. They might get, if it's too dry, they might get they need a certain, yeah. If the pH, if you're say in the water, the pH needs to be at in some range. Same with salinity. And then light, I called that a resource, but in a way you can also call it condition in the sense that some organisms, that organisms need light in order to survive. So that's both a condition and a resource. And then pollutants are included as a condition because some organisms can, some plants are lead tolerant. So you can tolerate lead in the soil, say, and some can't. And so sort of the amount of pollutants in the environment will set the conditions for different organisms. Okay, so those are examples of conditions. And some of them are also resources. So at the beginning, we talked about sort of that ecology is the relationship between organisms and each other and organisms and their physical environment. And the physical environment then is made up of the climate, the soil. So soil is definitely affected by sort of biotic things, but then fundamentally looking at sort of the geology and the minerals in the environment, soil is sort of defined by is a physical thing. And then sort of fundamental things like are you on the land? Are you in the freshwater? Are you in the saltwater? Are you in the brackish water? And then aspects of microenvironment. And I would also add here probably altitude. So how high up, say, up the mountain are you? Let's see if there's anything happening here in the chats. Okay. So let's see. Atmosphere will be counted as, okay, can we say pressure is a condition? Absolutely. Because some organisms live under high pressure and low pressure. So that's definitely, so pressure is a good example, should be on that list of conditions. So for example, deep underwater is a high pressure environment that some organisms are adapted to. And also higher up in a mountain is a low pressure environment that some organisms are adapted to. And so definitely pressure is a condition. Okay, I'm going to just mention just a little bit about climate. So because climate, well, as we saw in those sort of maps of the globe, climate is really important and changing. So the climate is the sort of made by the solar radiation, which is higher in the center of the globe and lower at the north and south ends. Elevation affects temperature. And then these processes, such as wind and rainfall, affect the climate. And so then the wind and the rainfall have, patterns that we know about. And so they have patterns spatially, like rainy areas and dry areas, so arid areas and rainforests and everything in between. And then they also vary temporally. And so both of those things go into how many different kinds of species and which species could live there. And we can think about, climate on different scales. So I'm just mentioning this about climate because it's so important. Right? So, so now we're just going back to the question, why is something living where it is? And so this picture just shows different kinds of environments, which obviously have different kinds of organisms. And it's due to a whole bunch of different things. So the abiotic conditions, characteristics of the species, we didn't talk so much about that. Interactions among species. There has to be the species you need, say, to eat, and you have to have mates, and there has to be not too many predators eating you, not too much disease. And it has to do with the geological history of the place the species are. It has to do with the sort of phylogenetic and evolutionary history of the organisms. And then there's another huge one. What is that? This one, I'm just going to be quiet till I hear the answer or see the answer. Okay, I'll give a hint. So think, okay, somebody says vegetation, maybe. Okay, so vegetation, I would put that in sort of the category of interactions. Like, for example, you can have grazing organisms where you have grass. So definitely vegetation for some species is important. But vegetation then itself, well, that might be related to temperature or rainfall or things like that. Food and shelter. Okay, I'm gonna do that with sort of interactions. That's the food. And shelter, I guess that would be That could be abiotic or also interactions.
Saskia, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, okay. So there's all these different species all over the globe. And I listed some reasons here, kind of what explains what those species being there. And there's one more big reason that isn't listed here. And I'm wondering if you guys have a guess as to that. Yes, anthropogenic activities. Okay, so people these days have moved species. So there's both species in new places where they didn't get on their own or did not evolve there. And then there's species that are missing or have much smaller populations than they would have before people were there, right? So we have species in new locations, and we have locations missing species. Tons of that due to people. Okay, so that was the big one that I was wanted to mention. Wind patterns, somebody say. I'm going to put that as abiotic conditions. Okay. Any more explanations besides these ones here? Coevolution. Okay, coevolution, that goes with the evolutionary phylogenetic history of the organism. So, okay, so somebody mentioned coevolution. So coevolution is when species evolve in response to the evolution of other species. And so one species evolves and another evolves in response, and they go back and forth and become specialized. And so that's, I put into the evolutionary phylogenetic history. Deforestation. So that's an example of the anthropogenic activities. So deforestation makes it so that species don't exist that used to exist in the forest. And it also leaves the environment open for invasion by species that can now live there. So both. And then somebody wrote temperature patterns. So temperature patterns could be just the abiotic sort of physical conditions of the globe, and then changes in temperature due to humans. Any more explanations about why organisms are where they are? Okay, so this is actually like huge because we're talking about very minute details of the moment, of like the contemporary moment, versus all the way down to sort of the geological history of the Earth and the whole evolutionary history of all organisms, right? So you need all of that information about the ancient past and the contemporary everyday presence to sort of say, why is an organism right here? Okay, I think, let me see. Okay, I think we're at a point, let me see what time it is. Okay, yeah. So I think we're at a point where I want to give you guys a little break. And what we're going to talk about next is populations. And so just to get you excited about it so that you come back from your break energized. So this is individuals live in populations, and the population size grows and shrinks. And so we're going to talk about sort of what does that look like and why? And that's sort of the basics of population ecology. So that's what we're going to talk about after the break, but I want to give you, because 2.5 hours is really long. So I want to give you guys a few minutes to sleep, to rest. So it's 11:15 right now, and we'll come back at 11:30. There's a 15-minute break, but please come back. Okay, so I'm going to go, but then I'll come sit here if you want to chat with. I'll be here during the break if you want to chat. Okay, so I see you guys back at 11:30. Wait, I think my audio is still on. Hang on. Okay, if any of you are around and want to talk about ecology, I'm here before we get started.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes.
Ma'am, is there any way to predict how the organisms would have looked if the continents never uh, shifted?
Oh, I see. So even if we had stayed with the Gondwana clumping
Yes.
together, what if there a way to know? Okay, I've never heard anyone sort of make predictions about that. That doesn't mean that nobody has, but I've never heard of it. But let's think. So if the continents all stayed together, then there would be less variation, less environmental variation. So there'd be less sort of diversity of different types of organisms. But there would also be more movement, more dispersal in the landscape, because there would be less sort of barriers to movement. So
Is there any software, something like that?
for doing that, well, it's interesting. I'm sure people have studied this a little bit, but it's not something I've heard of, that of like as a, like, yeah, people could, you could do a model, like you could take the land distribution and the climate and make a model and make a prediction, but I have never seen that before. It'd be super interesting.
Okay.
Maybe you
Thank
should do it. You should do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What time is it now? Okay, I'm just going to start with a question that was from the YouTube stream. And that was saying, what was the one reason that was not listed on the slide that I gave? Okay, reasons for organisms that live where they are. So that's this slide. And so the one reason is change due to being in the Anthropocene. So change due to people, both invasive species due to people moving species around intentionally and unintentionally, and then loss of species due to habitat fragmentation or habitat degradation or pollution or climate change. So that one reason is how people have changed the environment and the distribution of organisms. So that was it. Okay. I can't really tell how many people are back. Amanda, do you think people are back?
Yeah, almost like, I think we can start.
Okay, okay, I'll start. Okay, any more either comments or questions kind of about this question of why are organisms where they are before we move to a new topic? Okay, somebody once asked a similar question that what would diversity be if we remove the oceans? So that's similar to the question of if the continents had stayed clumped together, then the way they were, the Gondwanan shape, then what would happen? Okay, and so this question is, if we remove the ocean, there's only land, what would that mean? So other than the obvious that there wouldn't be any ocean organisms, which would get rid of a lot of diversity, if the whole globe was covered with land and somehow there was enough water and, well, if the whole globe was covered with land, then the temperature and wind and everything would change in some way that I don't know. And one thing that would happen would be there'd be few barriers to gene flow. And so there would be the opportunity for species to sort of have a larger ranges. But really what would happen would depend on how would that change the weather. So if you had land all over the earth, I'm not sure what the weather pattern would be. But maybe the question you're sort of asking is, if the environment wasn't variable, what would the diversity of organisms be? So if the environment were all sort of the same, how many different species would we have? And so again, we could have many species, like in the tropics, there are many species. But the species might have very similar resource needs. So that might be, for example, very competitive environment, but there still could be a lot of species. So there would be lots of evolutionary pressure trying to make species, say, more and more specialized in order to use this environment very well. But there wouldn't be, cold adapted and warm adapted organisms. So, but again, if we made the whole earth land, then that would change all the wind and the temperature and the rainfall patterns. And so we would have variability in the environment. We'd have different dry and wet areas and hot and cold areas. But I'm not quite sure how it would turn out. But these are things one could model. So the species diversity gradient would reduce. Well, that's true because, well, that's probably true. If the temperature gradient were reduced, then the species diversity gradient would also be reduced. But I'm not sure the temperature gradient would be reduced. But anyway, this is something one could model. So one big component, which you're going to hear about later in ecology is super complicated because there's so many interacting things, as I think you've sort of got from this topic of why are organisms where they are. So ecology is super complicated and hard to predict, hard to make predictions. And some things are happening on all sorts of spatial and temporal scales. And that's the kind of thing that's really good for sort of exploring through doing models, because in models, you can look at temporal scales and spatial scales and sort of environmental scales that you can't look at in real life. So these questions of what if Gondwana land never separated, or what if there was no oceans, or what if there was no temperature gradient, what would happen? We could model that. Maybe that's what you're going to go do. Okay, very interesting line of thought. Any other thoughts from this first part?
Hi, Saskia.
Hello.
Hi. So how to improve the organism on the lands? Actually, nowadays, a lot of spray on the farming land. So due to spray, so a lot of organism killed. So how to protect this?
So how to protect organisms from being killed due to spray? You mean like insecticides or something?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. So yeah, okay. So I think the question is, so we intentionally kill, say, pest insects and also pest diseases like fungus. And then in doing that, we also kill lots of other things. How can we improve that? Well, I guess two different ways, or several different ways. One of them is by trying to grow our food and what we need in ways where we don't have to spray. And so that would be like crop rotation and polyculture and having more tolerance of damage to our food and plant breeding. So breeding plants that are resistant to the pests. So various ways to make it so that we spray less. Also paying close attention to when we need to spray. Lots of times people spray on a schedule and they don't even know what the pests are. And so there's lots of extra spraying. Developing sprays that don't, or ways to spray that doesn't spread. So people sometimes spray an area and then because of wind, the spray goes out of the environment. So spraying better. I mean, those are all things that people are doing, but it's kind of tough to. I mean, it's pretty tough if our goal is to kill some organisms. We pretty much will always kill some other organisms that we don't want to kill. So definitely, it's a difficult problem, and so probably the direction to go is to figure out how to grow our food better with less spray.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, any other leftover questions from the first part or comments? Okay, so we're kind of changing gears now. Okay, so this is a picture kind of ecology. And the top says ecology, and then there's the first sort of row of things. And those are the things I sort of mentioned before: behavioral ecology, population ecology, community ecology, and then one that's covered by my chat, ecosystem ecology. And then things that we study relative to these things. And I'm actually not going to go over this whole figure. I just want to show you that in this whole set of things, what I'm going to talk about next and what we're going to discuss is population ecology. So this is the ecology of population size, sort of population dynamics. So how big is a population of a species and how is it changing, either increasing or decreasing or neither?
Saskia, there are two questions in the chat box.
Okay, let's see. Okay, one is how to deal with invasive species. Okay, how to deal with invasive species. Well, it's kind of too late for that. So two things. There's like the invasive species who have already invaded, and then there's the invasive species who haven't yet invaded. So the already invaded ones, some of those are super difficult because they're so well integrated into their community that it's too hard to get rid of them. So for example, say lantana in India, an invasive plant. So you could spend, a gazillion people could spend their days uprooting lantana and burning it, but you would still have lantana. It's like, it's here, and there's nothing really you can do about it. And there's plenty of invasive species like that. And you might argue that, say, the coronavirus is an invasive species, although it's also evolved. And so there's definitely some invasives that, in a way, the way we have to deal with them is by figuring out how to a lot of invasive species come, through transportation. So through shipping, through trains, trucks, even airplanes. And so I guess, and actually a lot of invasive species are stopped at the ports. And so for example, let's see, green snakes coming into Florida. So Florida has a bunch of invasive snakes, and they really want to keep more invasive snakes from coming. And so they put a lot of effort into looking at when ships bring in cargo, they check it and they fumigate it and things like that. So you can avoid some invasive species in those ways. But it's definitely a humongous problem. Another question is, can we consider migration and adaptation as factors in why organisms are found in specific areas? Definitely. So migration, I was sort of calling dispersal. So one of the reasons an organism is a place is because it went there. So that's definitely true. And then adaptation is, I guess, a species trait. So for example, which I didn't talk about too much, but it's in this list. I'll go back. So species characteristics. I think that's the same thing as adaptation, meaning, for example, polar bears are in the north because they're adapted to the cold weather. And so that's an adaptation. So definitely adaptation is one of the explanations as to why species are where they are. And I'm calling that characteristics, or you could also call that evolution. They've evolved it to be fit for that environment. Okay, and another question, how do barriers affect distribution? So let's see. Well, okay, we're not thinking about invasive species, we're sort of natural systems. So there's lots of barriers to gene flow could be oceans, or they could be inhospitable environments. So a tropical species can't really get across a desert. So that kind of a barrier. Mountains can be barriers, or valleys can be barriers. And so these barriers limit gene flow. And so that allows species to evolve to be different from each other. And so species ranges can be limited by barriers such as the edges of continents or the edges of habitat types. I hope if that's not an answer to the question, then ask some more. And then a comment that invasive species can be countered by introduction of their native natural predators. Okay, true. So yeah, when I said, oh, there's nothing to do about invasive species, that there actually have been things done about invasive species, which in some ways are successful. So if a species is invasive in a habitat, you can go back to its origin and say what was controlling it there, and bring that to the new habitat, and hopefully it will control it in the new place. And that's happened for agricultural pests, especially. And in some cases that works really well. And in some cases there's both examples when that works well, and then the invasive species is no longer considered invasive. And then there's some situations in which they bring the control organism is brought, and it may eat the invasive species, but it may also eat the native species. And an example of that, which I've worked with, is in the United States in forests. There was the gypsy moth, which was imported from Europe accidentally. And by the way, it has been called the gypsy moth until last year, when gypsy, which was a sort of a derogatory term for people, got changed to spongy. So now we have to call it spongy moth. But anyway, the spongy moth So a fly was introduced to control the spongy moth. And it was a bad choice because it doesn't really control the spongy moth, and it turns out to control better a lot of native moths in the northeastern US. And so actually that fly was a bad introduction. But on the other hand, there's been lots of good introductions too. Okay, another question. What if the invasive species fit into the food web of the ecosystem and it was introduced and also preyed on by another predator or herbivore? Okay, so this is at, okay, so a species ends up in a new environment and establishes a population. And we only really call it invasive if it's a problem. And by problem, we mean sort of displaces other organisms. So if it fits in and the population doesn't get very big, we just, maybe we don't notice it, or we don't really call it invasive. If the population doesn't spread and sort of change the community that it's in a lot. And one could argue that invasive species are good. For example, some fish species in lakes, so there's invasive fish species either brought in on purpose or accidentally, and they're actually better for human consumption than the native species. And so we think, and so at some level they're good, because say now the humans who use those lakes for food have a better food source. Maybe the invasive species are easier to catch, they grow faster. And so you could say those invasive, so at one level, those invasive species are good if you're thinking human-centrically. And if you're thinking ecologically, they might be bad because they've displaced the native fish. So you can think of invasive species as good. Okay, and continuing on the invasive species theme, invasive species used as biological control, right? So we can intentionally introduce a species, and then if we don't like the outcome, we call it invasive, such as that fly I just mentioned in the eastern United States or eastern North America. Okay, continuing with invasive species, when an alien invasive species invades and is naturalized where it's not invasive anymore, where can we draw the line? Okay, yeah. So sometimes some species have been around for so long, we don't even know they're invasive, or we're just so used to them. We sort of have integrated them into our culture. And so we don't really think of them as invasive. And usually then we call them naturalized. And it's very subjective. Usually if we use the word naturalized, that means we kind of like the species being there. And we use the word invasive, it means we don't like the species being there. Naturalized sometimes just mean it's been there for so long, we don't know really what it displaced. So there's lots of examples of naturalized species. Well, in Europe, there's a lot of naturalized species, meaning people think of them as sort of native European species, but then if you look phylogenetically at their history, they're not actually native. And those are naturalized. Okay. Then continuing with invasive species, if an invasive species has medicinal value, is it considered invasive? Okay, that's sort of like the fish example I gave. A species could be invasive in the ecological sense, meaning on its own, when it's there, it displaces the native community, displaces or it messes up the native community, displacing species. And so it's invasive in an ecological sense. But if we want it around, if it has a medicinal purpose that we use, if it's food that we use, we may not call it invasive. It depends on what our sort of frame is. If we're an ecologist, we might call it invasive. If we're a fish eating community, we might not call it invasive. If the medicinal thing has a great value to us, we say, oh, well, it's displacing native plants, but it's useful to us, so it's not invasive. Okay. Any more questions about invasive species or anything? Okay. Okay. Population ecology. Okay, so organisms, including humans, live in populations, and they have some size. So there's a species, and then the species lives in populations, and in different places, the populations are different sizes. And quite often, but not always, the population is either growing or getting smaller. Yeah, getting larger or smaller, or it can be staying the same. Okay. So here I'm showing you a picture of paramecia. So a paramecium is like a single-celled aquatic organism. Maybe you looked at them under microscopes. They have cilia, so they sort of swim around, and they grow and they reproduce really fast. So look, in this case, they have a generation every day. Okay, so say you started your Petri dish on day 0 with one. Oh yeah, the other thing is they don't need a pair to reproduce. They can just they go from 1 to 2 on their own. They don't need to mate. Okay, so on day 0, you put one paramecium in a Petri dish, and there's a ton of food in the Petri dish. So what I want you guys to do, and I think you probably need paper and a pen for this, so you can get that. And I want you to draw a plot of on the horizontal axis, right, number of days. I'm doing this too, number of days. And on the vertical axis, right, number of paramecium. Okay. I'm giving you guys a minute to find your pens. All right. And then I want you to draw a line. So imagine you start out on day 0 with one paramecium in this picture, and you get up to day 6. Draw a line that represents how that growth goes. I'm doing it too. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so I think you see me now, is that right? Let's see, are you seeing my face?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Here's my drawing. Can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, now I'm going to share the screen again. Okay. So, any drawings different than those? That? Well, probably there were some drawings different than that. Okay, how about this? Did my drawing look reasonable to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anybody have any other, did you draw something much different? Okay. So, the drawing I drew is exponential growth of the population, which probably you guys have heard about. And so in this case, the paramecium population doubles every day. Okay, somebody says there should be a stationary phase at the end. Okay, it's linear, going up with the number of days and population of the paramecium. Okay, so if it were, okay, so first, I'll address this first one. It should have a stationary phase at the end. Why do you think it should have a stationary stage at the end? Anybody? Somebody else can answer that. Okay, nutrient deficiency. Okay.
Could it be that the death rate and the growth rate has reached some equal levels?
Okay, yes. Okay, so you guys are all saying the same thing. Carrying capacity, resources not available, limited resources, nutrient deficiency. Okay, so say I showed you what it did for 10 days and it looked like this figure, see these dots? This is an exponential growth curve right now. We're going to get to the flat part in a bit. And so it started out with 0, and in 10 days, there's 1,024 because it doubles, the population doubles every day. Okay. So, but if you look at this picture, it looks like it's getting pretty crowded in there, right? So there probably is some nutrient limitations, right? So, but let's pretend just for now, we're definitely going to get to the limitations, but let's pretend just for now that there is not a nutrient limitation, that I keep on adding the food they need. And so it's getting a little crowded in there, but they're happy, meaning that they're still having their intrinsic growth rate. And their intrinsic growth rate just means that they're reproducing at the rate that they are if they have no resource limitation. And that's what you need for this exponential growth, no resource limitation. Okay, so I agree with you. It looks really crowded in there and that on day 6. And so probably there is one, but just for fun, we're going to say there's not. Okay, so still saying this, just imagine, okay, now we're thinking still no resource limitation at all. And if we look at different organisms, so this is some examples of exponential growth where there's no resource limitation. And so they're growing at their intrinsic, the population is growing at its intrinsic growth rate or exponential growth rate. Different organisms have different shapes of this exponential curve. So, and so these are sort of different growth rates. What would be reasons? So now remember, we're not at resource limitation yet. Okay, reasons that these might be different, given that there's enough resources for everybody. These are not growing together. Like the red creatures, it's a different container than the green and the blue. This is showing that different kinds of creatures, different species, have different exponential growth rates. Exponential means no limiting, nothing limiting, no resource limitation. Why are these, what are reasons that these red, green, and blue could be different? Okay, so somebody said, reproductive rate is different. That's it. So imagine if I'm looking at a tree. Well, okay, say an elephant versus a paramecium. And I'm going to look at it for 10 days. So a 10 days, if I was looking at an elephant for 10 days, I would have to be looking at an elephant for like 1,000 years, right? In order to see its exponential growth rate versus the paramecium, I might look at it for 10 days. So growth rate, they have different growth rates. And so relative to the time that I'm looking at. Okay, so people wrote besides, so that's the main answer. Reproductive growth rate is different. Density, somebody mentioned density. So density Well, we could think two things. One, the density that I start with might affect sort of where on the growth curve I'm looking at. So in this one, I'm starting at 0. So we're all starting at the same density, and then they have different growth rates. But say I started at 10, I would see a different curve than if I started a different part of the curve than if I started at 1,000. So density in that sense is important. But density, but since there's no resource limitation, it's not that they're growing at a different rate because there isn't any resource limitation. Growth rate varies. Yep. Differences in the life cycle. So I'm going to say that's growth rate. Like that means generation time. Animal size. Animal size probably because it's correlated with generation time. Not totally, but often. External factors such as diseases. Well, that would definitely change the growth rate of the population. And I guess if the disease were not density dependent, we could say that, like in the sick population, the rate of reproduction is slower than in the healthy population, but often disease is density dependent, so it wouldn't have this exponential growth rate. Okay, so main answer is different generation time, which causes a different rate of growth of the population. And so if it's steep, it has a fast generation time, and if it's shallow, it has a slow generation time. Okay. Okay, this isn't all theoretical. These things happen in real life. And so you could think, I don't think, okay, they happen in Petri dishes, but Petri dishes aren't real life. And you might say, well, you can't ever see exponential growth in real life because there's always resource limitations, which is sort of true, that for the most of the time, populations are resource limited. But there are situations where they're not. And so, for example, if a population is limited by predators and then the predators are removed and there's plenty of food, then at least for a while, the population can grow exponentially. And so for example, what happened to bison in the Yellowstone National Park. So they were almost extinct, and then they did things to conserve them, and so the population did very well, and it grew very fast, and so it fits the exponential curve. But for the most part, individual species or populations are being limited by some resource, and they're not growing exponentially. Okay. How about people? Whoops. I'm still thinking about people. Okay. So this is a growth curve showing human population. So are humans growing exponentially?
Actually, if we consider the last 2000 years, then very close to exponential growth, we can say that.
Right. So yeah, maybe a long time ago, it was not so close to exponential growth, but then it's gotten more exponential. So that's true. So how come early humans were not growing exponentially, do you think? You being any of you.
I think the one of the reasons can be that when we started living together in a groups, we were benefiting each other, which increased our life expectancy. And for few hundred years, it may be the medical facilities and other things, and our knowledge to the ecology can be the reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is generally, I agree. Any other thoughts by others? High food production. Okay, and then somebody wrote reduction in fertility. I would say increase in fertility, but maybe past reduction. Agriculture, healthcare was not advanced, death rates were higher, and birth rates and survival rates. Yeah. Okay. So, right. So, say before agriculture, and during early agriculture, we were limited by food. And so we were not growing so food and disease, we were not growing exponentially because we did, yeah, our birth rates were relatively low compared to our death rates. And then as we developed agriculture and tools, industrial revolution, we got to be had lower death rates. And one sort of thing about humans, I mean, so why haven't all organisms does this? So one sort of thing about, one way to think about humans is we're really good at overcoming our resource limitations. Like over the time that there's been humans, we run into resource limitations or some kinds of limitations, and then we overcome them. And so that means that even though something may have been limiting in the past, it becomes not limiting anymore. And so we keep reproducing faster and faster. A little bit scary. Okay. But presumably that can't go on forever. All right. Okay, so then go back to your drawing of the paramecium and add in that over the days, the resource is getting used up. And so for those of you that knows, this is sort of changing it from an exponential to a logistic growth curve. But even if you don't know the terms, draw how you imagine that might look. So as you saw, the paramecium got all crowded in that dish. Presumably, they're not getting as much food. Okay. And so you get to something like this, where for a while the population was growing exponentially when it wasn't food limited, and then it became food limited. You also may have drawn it that it goes down, like it uses up all the food and the food isn't being replenished, and so the population size might go smaller. But we're going to sort of use the scenario that the population grows until it becomes sort of at the limit of where the food in its surroundings can support it, or the space or whatever. Okay, so this is the logistic growth curve. And again, in real life, many populations, of course, are sort of at the flat area, or at least they're not at the first part of the area. But there are examples of this that have been going on. So here's an example of kind of logistic growth. So this is another example of the change in animal population after conservation. So before 1975, the California sea lions, I grew up in California, so I like this example. were almost extinct because of competition with fisheries and also because of competition with humans for spaces for them to have their, to sort of raise their kids on the beach. And so in 1975, they started conserving them and changing the human fisheries so the fish was available, and the population went up. And so this is abundance of the adult females over time. And this can be fit mathematically to fit pretty well a logistic curve. So it didn't spend very much time in the exponential phase. It sort of started out exponential and then moved logistic. And I'm using this example to illustrate two things. So one is the idea, which some of you have written in the notes, of carrying capacity. And so this is the population size that, that the environment can support. And so, for example, the environment seems to be able to support 275,000 female sea lions. And if we added fish to the environment, say we decrease the human fishery even more, then we would expect the carrying capacity to go up. But given the conditions, it's leveling out at about 275,000 female sea lions. So that's the carrying capacity. Another sort of parameter that is interesting to people, especially if we're thinking about conservation, is sort of the area in which the population is growing the fastest. And that's often the sort of the maximum net productivity moment or time. And so below, the population is sort of small. So even though the per capita growth rate is high, meaning that individuals are reproducing at the fastest rate they can, it's still not growing that fast because there aren't that many individuals. But then at some middle point, there's pretty many individuals and they still aren't limited by any resources. And that's when the population is growing the fastest. So it's not when an individual is having the most kids, it's when, because the individual might be having the most kids down here where there's no resource limitation, but it's when the population is growing at the fastest rate. So like the steepest part of the curve. And so that's a thing that people like to look at to see sort of when you're thinking about conservation of a species that's in danger. Okay. Check this chat. Okay. Okay. That's just sort of a summary about what we've been talking about. And then before I go on to the sort of chapter 2 of this, we think about the size of the population. We think about the density of the population. Usually that's with respect to, because we're concerned about density dependence, which we see with logistic growth. We think about the population growth rate. And the population growth rate, there's sort of two components of it. There's the intrinsic growth rate, meaning how fast is it growing if there was no resource limitation? So that's that exponential thing. And when we looked at that one figure that showed those 3 different exponential lines, steep and not so steep, those are different intrinsic growth rates. Versus the per capita growth rate, which means the growth rate of an individual, which can change depending in a population, depending on resource limitation. So when there's not resource limitation, it's the same as the intrinsic growth rate. But when there is resource limitation, then it's smaller. And then the idea of the carrying capacity. So these are just like super useful terms in population ecology. So before I move on, because we're going to need these terms, do you have any questions or comments about these words? Okay, and somebody asks, what does that growth, the highest growth rate, okay, somebody asks what this MNPL, the maximum net productivity level, what does that have to do with conservation? So, well, there's two things. One is that sometimes if you do a conservation, like say you set aside habitat for an organism, or you improve the environment for some species, and then it's growing, but you don't know if it's you don't know if it's like where in the you don't know whether it's growing exponentially or how fast the growth rate is going. And so if you look at it over time, then you can say that that this time the maximum net productivity level is the time at which it's reached the point where it was starting to be resource limited. Because after that, it's no longer growing at the fastest rate. So it's sort of trying to figure out the resource limitation of a species during conservation. Okay, and somebody asks, explain the per capita growth rate again. Yes, okay. So the intrinsic growth rate is how fast is it growing if there's no resource limitation? Meaning each mother, say, each parent, each mother is having her maximum number of offspring. And so that's the intrinsic growth rate, and that causes exponential growth of the population. So if you look at this logistic curve, then at the beginning of the curve, the individuals have the per capita growth rate, which is the same as the intrinsic growth rate, because they're not limited by resources. But as they start to be limited by resources, their growth rate changes, meaning they have slightly fewer offspring because they're starting to be resource limited. And so the per capita growth rate is just at any point on this curve, the individuals have a different growth rate, and that's their per capita growth rate. And that different growth rate is sort of relative to the intrinsic growth rate. So there's the intrinsic growth rate, and then there's the sort of actual growth rate, and that's the per capita growth rate. Hopefully that helps. Okay, any more questions? Okay, one other thing that people sometimes are confused about is in the carrying capacity, is that carrying capacity, you could think of it as an attribute of the organism, but it's actually an attribute of the organism in that particular environment, in those particular environmental conditions. So the carrying capacity for an organism changes if the environmental conditions change. For example, if humans were fishing less in the same place as the sea lions like to eat, then the carrying capacity of sea lions would go up. So carrying capacity is kind of a dynamic thing. Okay, so let's see what time it is. Okay, I have one more topic, which is related to population ecology, which is thinking about small populations. There's sort of two topics in small populations, and one of them is genetic. For example, when populations are very small, they get inbred, and inbreeding has a deleterious effect because sort of bad attributes in the genome show up in these sort of genetic things. But what I'm going to talk about is more ecological things. And that is termed the Ali effect. So the Ali effect is when survival at small population size is bad compared to survival at large population size. And we're going to get to how that might occur. But okay, so this figure here that we're looking at, notice that it has a sort of a shape like we've been talking about it, but we're using it quite differently. So this is the probability on the vertical axis is the probability of extinction. And then on the horizontal axis is the initial population size. And so one way to sort of express the Ali effect is saying that is looking at the red figure, the red plot. If there's a strong Ali effect, then the probability of extinction is higher at smaller size. Okay, I'm gonna leave that at that because I think we need some more concrete examples. Okay, so, oh yeah, before we get to the concrete examples, so some examples of the Ali effect. Really classical examples are in really small populations, individuals might not be able to find each other to mate. And so they don't reproduce. And so that could mean that, you know, smaller fractions of the individuals ever have any offspring. And so there's like and so if the population gets bigger, there's more mating success. And so it grows. And so the population does better. So not being able to find mates is a classic Ali effect. There's another one where which is kind of related to that is that individuals are attracted to each other. And so if there aren't very many individuals around, then they don't notice each other. And so they go away. And so it sort of reinforces the population being small. And another Ali effect is group defense. So if an animal lives in herds, then if you have a very small herd, you can't defend the group against predators as well as if you have a big herd. And so if you're the member of a small herd, you have a higher rate of mortality than if you're a member of a big herd. Those examples make sense? Hopefully those examples make sense to make it a little more concrete. Okay, so population ecologists, you know, talk about this in quantitatively. And so I'm just going to show it quantitatively just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So here's the per capita population change. So at 0, it means that the population size is not changing at all. And a negative number means that it's decreasing, and positive numbers means that it's increasing. And so this is the density of starfish. And so and this is a real thing that happened. So if the population is low, so take this 100 starfish population size, then the population is getting smaller, will get smaller, versus if the population is high, like, oh, sorry about that. The population is high, well, for the most part, then the population will increase. And so the question, and so intuitively you'd think that's weird. Why would the population, because we've been talking about how when the population is small, it should get bigger, right? That's what I've been sort of saying, that's the exponential growth. But here I'm looking at these data about starfish, and actually if the population is small, then next year it's going to be smaller. So you can see how this is like the opposite of what I was just talking about. And in this case, the reason is because the starfish are better at escaping from predation if they're in larger groups. So starfish that are in small groups get eaten more than starfish that are in big groups. And so that's the explanation in this case for the Ali effect. And so the interesting thing about this, well, one of the interesting things about this is it's like the opposite of what we normally are talking about when we're thinking about changes in population size, such as the exponential growth. Now, you might be thinking, wow, this is sort of an obscure thing. But it's not really that obscure. And so this Ali effect, meaning it's detrimental to be in a small population. And so this is a figure from an article which was sort of trying to say how common is the Ali effect in different kinds of organisms, and what are the reasons for it. And so, for example, the reasons for it are the mechanisms. So, for example, take that top mechanism, mate limitation. That means in small populations, there aren't mates available, or individuals don't find mates. And so that's been found in terrestrial arthropods, which means insects mostly, invertebrates in the ocean, a little bit in mammals, a little bit in birds, not really studied in fish, and has been found a lot in plants. Now, an important thing to think about just as a researcher is like the size of those circles represents like the number of studies that have found that. And so we might think, oh, it's really common in plants and not common in fish. But actually, all we know is that it's been studied a lot in plants and studied less in fish. We don't actually know if there is a lot of mate limitation in fish in small populations. It just means that it hasn't been studied so much, probably. So, but what we do see here is that, okay, in all these different kinds of organisms, in small populations, there's examples of the Ali effect. And then other sort of mechanisms, cooperative defense, predator satiation, that's the example. That's the example with the starfish. So if the starfish are in a small group and a fish comes, then it will eat them all. But if it's in a larger group, then the fish comes, they're not that hungry. And so some of them won't get eaten. Cooperative breeding, if you need a bunch of individuals for breeding, if you need a bunch of individuals for feeding. And then sometimes Ali effects are found, but the mechanism isn't really understood why. Okay. So I think, not sure why everything just went black. What happened to my, oh, I see. Sorry about that. Let me just get this sharing back. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully what you got from this population part was patterns of population growth, kind of vocabulary that's associated with population biology, and then one mechanism that sort of inhibits population growth, which is this Ali effect. And then in discussing the Ali effect, we talked a little bit about sort of basically behavioral ecology, because most of the mechanisms of the Ali effect are related to behavior. And I think that's all of the material that I want to cover, but I'd like you guys to, especially in this last part, I just sort of talked, I'd like you guys to either ask me questions or add to what I said.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
There was a point like in the figure there is written habitat amelioration, which is less studied in mammals. So can you explain a bit about it, habitat amelioration?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, again, the question marks mean either it's less studied or it's studied and they haven't found it, and we actually don't know the difference, right? So it could be that that's a problem with these kinds of papers. We don't really know. But so you mean, I think you mean, what does habitat amelioration mean? So in this case, it means that I'm trying to think of an example of it. What it means is that the organisms sort of create a good environment for themselves, but it takes multiple individuals to make the habitat good. And I'm just trying to think of an example of that.
Ma'am, could that like in mammals, I mean, particularly in primates, the nesting places, could that be an example here?
Well, let's see. So the nesting places are usually made by pairs or by individuals. So, and in some cases, I guess it takes several individuals to do it, but that would be like the cooperative breeding. That would be the cooperative breeding example. Do you mean something different than that? Yeah, it's funny. I can't think of an example for the habitat amelioration thing right this second. I don't know. I'll try to think about one while we're talking about other things, unless one of you have thought of them. So it's when the population needs to establish the right habitat in order for the whole group to persist. I'm just trying to think of what those would be. Okay, I'll keep thinking in the background. Can I explain the R value? So the R value, that would be back in the, let's see where I put, where that was here. Is that the R value you mean? Okay, well, I'll say it is. So the R value is, it's basically the intrinsic rate of reproduction. So and one way to think about it would be sort of the generation time. So it's the intrinsic generation time. How fast does the population grow? How fast does the population grow if it's not resource limited is the R value. And so like an R value of 2, that means it doubles every generation. Okay, other questions?
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
There has been a talk going in the community, in the scientific community, that whether we should bring the extinct animal back by the means of biotechnology or we shouldn't.
Uh-huh. Okay, so do you mean like extinct, like recently extinct, or like dinosaurs? Which I mean,
not that much, but like the dodo
yeah,
from the Mauritius or Stiller's sea cow,
right,
like these examples.
Yeah, okay.
Or the mammoth, which people usually consider that they were imported for the tundra region.
Yes, right. Okay, and so the question is that good or bad? Is that sort of the, or
yes,
opinions?
whether we should, whether we should bring them back or
yeah. So, well, that's sort of it's kind of a philosophical question, and maybe even an ethics question. If I think about it, I think about it in the context of, say, okay, I'm from the United States, so I think about this more in the United States, of bringing back large grazing animals to the grasslands in the United States. And we've kind of replaced them with cows, or we have replaced them with cows. So yeah, it's kind of subjective. On the one hand, everything is so changed anyway I kind of think, oh, it doesn't really matter. Like, you could bring them back. They may or may not survive. They'll probably change the environment in some way, but they're not going to make it better or worse. So my own personal feeling is it's like everything is so modified, it doesn't really matter whether we bring them back. But I know people feel pretty strongly. They sort of, you think you want to try to restore things to before humans modify them. And so our goal is to sort of like fix what we broke. And another option, and the opposite is saying that, well, those have gone extinct and now things are different. And if you bring those back, it's going to change things. It won't necessarily make things better. Those are sort of the two kind of sides. I don't know. What do you think? What do any of you think?
Actually, I consider that the species, those who get extinct due to the anthropogenic effect, at least they must be rejuvenated. Otherwise, the species like dinosaur or many other species which went off in the mass extinctions or any other thing, they are not needed. That's why they were eliminated.
Okay, so if things disappeared before people, then they're gone. And if they disappeared due to people, then they should be brought back. That's what you think.
Yes.
Yeah. Any of you, the others? It's a super controversial thing. Anybody have a different point of view? For some species, it might be pretty hard to bring them back. Like you'd have to do a lot of restoration to make it possible for them to persist. Is it realistic that we can do that restoration? In some cases, it's not. It's an interesting question, and one that probably as time goes by, we have to face more and more as more species become extinct. We have to think about whether we want to bring them back or not. Okay, there's another question about R. Is R always positive? No. If the population size is getting smaller, then R is below 0. Okay, more questions? Okay, here's a question. If we keep on overcoming our resistance of population growth, can humans achieve exponential growth? I guess right now we're going the opposite direction. Currently, our growth we used to have a higher R than we have now, meaning the exponent, we used to be growing more exponentially than we have been in the past. And in theory, if we keep overcoming resource limitations and disease, then we keep growing exponentially. Presumably, since there's just one Earth, we can't just grow exponentially forever. And as we make the environment, if we change the environmental conditions, for example, due to climate change, say less of the Earth is inhabitable by humans, then we're going to change the carrying capacity of the Earth, and then it'll be harder for us to be growing exponentially. So I would say that while we're really good at overcoming resource limitation, as the Earth fills up with people and we use more resources, that it gets harder and harder for us to overcome that, and the Earth's carrying capacity decreases. But we're pretty good at figuring out how to not be resource limited. And there's another question, does population density ever grow beyond the carrying capacity? Is it possible to have a population that's higher than the carrying capacity? Okay, I'm going to go back to there's a slide, this one. Okay, so in this picture, the blue dots. I'm not sure what they are. Oh, paramecium. So the paramecium population grew exponentially for a while, and then it leveled off. And the black line shows like a logistic fit. And then the blue dots show actual data. And you can see that some of them are above the black line and some of them are below the black line. And so you can have a population that goes above the carrying capacity temporarily. But you can't really have it go above, if it goes above the carrying capacity for many generations, then that wasn't the carrying capacity. It's sort of, the carrying capacity is defined as where the population levels off. And so if the population levels off at a different place, then that's the carrying capacity. But that being said, if you look at real data, it will jitter around, sometimes a little bit above, sometimes a little bit below the carrying capacity, depending on, you know, micro conditions. So I guess the answer to your question is no, except for temporarily. Okay, good questions. Any more? Event over the whole material that we talked about today, or that we didn't talk about, I guess. And if you want to ask questions, you can just say them or write them. Okay, then I think what I'm going to do is, technically we're doing this until 1. I'll stick around until 1, but I'm done with the content that we had, so you can leave, and then we're back in at 2. So at 2, you'll have the workshop on evolution, and so go have some lunch, walk around, get some fresh air, and then come back at 2. And I'll just stick around if anybody feels like asking any questions, but there's no need to stay here. I think it's better to go eat some food and stuff like that. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, so you're totally welcome to leave and you're totally welcome to stay for the next few minutes. And thank you for coming this morning. Let's see, can we increase the carrying capacity? Okay, can we increase the carrying capacity of humans or just in general? So of humans, in a way, we do that by plant breeding or disease control, vaccination. So vaccination, plant breeding, irrigation, those are ways that we increase the carrying capacity for humans. Which doesn't necessarily increase the carrying capacity for other organisms as well. Okay, if you're sitting around here, you might as well ask questions. All right, you're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome. Okay, somebody asked, what inspired me to get into research? Well, I think I was one of those kids that walked around and caught lizards and bugs and I just naturally was interested in biology, but I didn't actually know that one could be a biologist because my family weren't scientists. And so it wasn't until I was a university student that I had a job just for money, taking care of insects in a lab, and realized that one could be a biologist. And I guess insects and all the exciting things they do inspired me to do research. But I think maybe it came naturally. I was just really interested in animals as a kid. How about you? Okay, any of you want to tell me what got you interested in research or even in ecology? I'm curious. All of you are just black boxes. Okay, bird behavior. Bird behavior, that's a good one. I love everything about nature, so I can't decide on my area of research. Is there a way to figure it out? That's a tough one. Well, probably you don't love everything about nature equally. Probably the thing to do is to expose yourself to different things, like going to lectures about different aspects of nature and seeing which ones inspire you the most. I think usually it ends up that there are some things that are just super intriguing or seem very important to you if you expose yourself to enough different things. So I guess my advice is to try to learn about different aspects of nature that might be either important or seem really intriguing, and see where your most energetic interests lie. It is true that, okay, somebody says, it's fascinating that dead chemistry somehow manifests into life. It's true, life is, that we get life out of just these physical things is amazing. I agree about that. Okay, I think since the questions are getting over, I'm going to go away. So come back to discuss evolution soon. Bye-bye.